Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here, and greetings from a finally snowy Davos, as we've had unusually balmy weather here. We have a very brief 30 minutes, so I want to spare you my preamble. My name is Ishaan Tharoor. I'm a foreign affairs columnist at the Washington Post. We are here for the crises beneath the headlines. As you are all aware, we've spent, especially us in the media, have spent a lot of time consumed by two major conflicts on the world, in Gaza and in Ukraine. But of course, as the world struggles to settle those conflicts, there's myriad other crises elsewhere that have not received the same attention, and we hope in this session to talk through some of the other deep problems and challenges that we're seeing elsewhere. With me to do that, I have a tremendous panel. To my immediate left is Comfort Arrow, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the International Crisis Group, Kathy Russell, the Executive Director of UNICEF, and Professor Ricardo Hausmann, the founder of the Growth Lab at Harvard University. Comfort, I'd love to start with you. I think, given that we're here to talk about some of these crises, it would, from your vantage point at a tremendous think tank that informs a lot of my understandings about conflicts elsewhere, could you give me a sense of where your focus is in 2025 in terms of some of these hotspots that we're not talking about enough?
Yeah, thank you very much, and it's really good to see Davos have this conversation. I mean, I have a confession to make for an organization that is conflict prevention and early warning, and whose byline is also to focus on those conflicts that are off the radar. I mean, there's never been any time in crisis groups 30 years, and we're 30 this year, where our work this year is going to be dominated by big power rivalry and by major power competition, and how that infects and have significant impact on a number of conflicts as well. So I think it's worth just acknowledging that I think it'll be hard for us to ignore that fact as well. I say that also because our 10 conflicts to watch is very much influenced by that as well, that we do annually as well. When you look at the list of countries that are on there, Gaza, Iran, US, Syria, Ukraine, all those conflicts are very much on there because we expect a significant change with the past on US policy as well. The two outliers on the list are Sudan and Myanmar. Haiti, by the way, we see a significant US change as well. So I just wanted to sort of make that confession that, for an organization that spends an awful lot of time bringing the news of unreported conflicts, it's hard to ignore major power competition. Having said that, there was a time when the Haitis, the Venezuelas, the Yemens, all those kind of conflicts, the Sahel, would have been a major preoccupation for all international actors, for aid agencies as well. And the reality is that the room has been absorbed by Gaza and Ukraine as well. But we are witnessing wars rising in every single region that we work in, from the Latin Americas right through to Europe, to Africa. Fewer African conflicts on our list, but that doesn't mean that there aren't conflicts going on in the continent, right through to Asia as well. And when we look at the headlines, there's also one issue that I'd like to push back on. I do not necessarily think that these conflicts are off the radar. I think they've been deprioritized because of the bandwidth and the capacity, and because there's just an inordinate amount of conflicts on the rise at the same time. And there is a bandwidth capacity issue, whether it's at the Secretariat, whether it's at the UN, whether it's even at the humanitarian aid agencies. And I'm talking at a time where we're going to see this year, 2025, will also be undermined by the just sheer funding shortage as well. So I think these are just important caveats. But in terms of what's keeping me awake at night beyond Gaza and Ukraine, there is one good news: Syria. And I want to underline Syria because it is a good news opportunity, but that good news opportunity is only a moment, and it will fly by us if we don't seize the opportunity that we may have now to work with these new authorities. Hold your noses up to them and find a way in which to work with them. This was a Syrian-owned moment. They have usurped, decades of repression And this is an opportunity to find a way in which to address that as well. And I would also remind us to keep an eye on what is happening in Libya as well. Libya slips off the radar, and yet, at any given moment, the frozenness of Libya will unfreeze at any given moment. So I keep an eye on that, and I'll stop there.
Well, we'll circle back to some of these places in the conversation. Kathy, your organization is in the eye of the storm in many ways, and while you have been working for children in Gaza and children in Ukraine, could you talk more about the crises facing children elsewhere? I'm thinking especially in Sudan, where we have hideous data on malnutrition, potential famine, perhaps actual famine, and of course a generation of kids out of school there. Tell us a bit more about that and also the broader canvas that you're working on right now.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ishaan. Let me start a little broad and then come in. And I certainly associate myself with Comfort's remarks. I think she's really right on in these thoughts that she's had. But I would say a couple things. One, and most importantly, the humanitarian system is struggling, really struggling to try to respond to the sheer scale and number of the crises. For us at UNICEF, our focus is on children. We estimate that more than 213 million children live in 146 countries and territories and will need humanitarian assistance. I mean, the numbers are just overwhelming, for sure. The crises tend to overlap in a way and be related to each other, but they include conflict. Climate change is a real crisis that we're trying to deal with because it puts countries in a very difficult place trying to deal with the social needs of their populations. We have public health emergencies, and of course we have rising poverty. I think the key from our perspective is that we need global solidarity and support to try to respond to some of the crises, and we have seen that in Gaza. We've certainly seen it in Ukraine, and that has contributed to saving children's lives. But the needs of millions of other children, and we do talk about them as forgotten crises. I mean, obviously we don't forget about them, but they are largely ignored by. For us, it's donors, and donors are largely driven by media. I mean, that's a generalization, but it is kind of what goes on. And this includes for us Haiti, Myanmar, Sudan, Syria. At this point, about 50% of our humanitarian funding, and most of our funding comes earmarked for different places, went to only 5 emergencies. Excuse me. So it makes it challenging for us to find the resources for these other places. I'm just going to mention, I will talk about Sudan, I promise, but I did want to mention Haiti because Haiti is just kind of the scale and the scope of the brutality that we're seeing in Haiti is really shocking. More than 700,000 people, including 365,000 children, are displaced because of violence perpetrated by these armed gangs. 6 million people need humanitarian assistance, with most facing really serious food insecurity. We are seeing high numbers and just the really horrible nature of sexual violence there, family separation, recruitment of children by the gangs. I was there several months ago now. It all blurs together, but heard just horrific stories. And just to give you an example, and I say this only because it's hard to really understand the nature of the violence, but I met a woman who told me that she had been attacked by an armed gang. They raped her. The gang tried to attack her sister, and her sister fought back so aggressively that they burned her alive. And I have to say, for all the bad places I've been, or bad situations and bad stories, the nature of the violence is really horrible there, and I think it's something that people should be paying a little bit more attention to. Sudan, the thing about Sudan is the scale of it, right? It's the largest displacement crisis in the world. The humanitarian access is really challenging. There's alarming food insecurity. We have famine in parts of the country, malnutrition, obviously, in multiple locations, grave violations, again, against children, including the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, which is really terrible for children because they stumble onto these things. Just horrific rape and sexual violence, including against children. And so I think Sudan, you mentioned the education crisis. There are 19 million children in Sudan who are school age. 17 million of those children are out of school and have been out of school now for a year and a half. So it's just the scale, the numbers in Sudan are really very alarming, and our ability to get to some of these populations is not impossible, but it is very, very difficult because of the violence. And then I would just come in a little bit on Syria too. I do see, and we see this as, you know, everybody's happy-ish, you know, hopeful. I wouldn't say we're 100% sure of how things are going to go there, but it certainly is a moment that we think, you know, could be better than it has been for the last, you know, decade and some years. And I think that the challenges, and I was also there not that long ago either, and so much of the infrastructure has been destroyed, and again, over 1 million, 2 million children are out of school. 5 million children are living in places with landmines and unexploded ordnances, and that's become a leading cause of death and injury for children. So my point is that there's hope on the political side. The humanitarian needs remain really high, both because of the conflict and also, remember, they had an earthquake 2 years ago, and it's still, the country's really struggling, and the humanitarian community is struggling to try to be helpful.
It's worth understanding the carve-out as well, the humanitarian carve-out on sanctions in Syria.
I mean, yes, and we're, yeah.
Oh no, I was mentioning the humanitarian carve-out on sanctions, and if that makes a difference.
I mean, we feel like we can operate there. Again, it's a resource question, and that's really the challenge, is to try to get, again, the attention draws the resources, and so, you know, not having a lot of attention to it is a problem. So I would just mention, you know, some other places: Burkina Faso, Venezuela, Lebanon, Mozambique, Cameroon, the Sahel, DRC, on our list of worries. And I guess my message would be, all of these problems require concerted action and cooperation to try to address them.
That's great, Kathy. Thank you for that. And just, you know, we had the new Syrian foreign minister here yesterday, and his very simple and loud call was for an end to U.S. and EU sanctions, which is politically quite a complicated thing to roll back. Right. Yeah. Ricardo, to turn to you, we've talked about a lot of parts of the world. We've not talked about Latin America yet. Venezuela is now some months removed from a stolen election and an enduring political and humanitarian crisis. You've seen huge flows of migrants going towards the U.S. border, and other instabilities in the region. What are you looking at in 2025 in the Western Hemisphere?
Well, I think you've pointed out very clearly the reason why Venezuela sometimes makes it to the news. I think we can list all the situations that have become humanitarian crises, but oftentimes they become humanitarian crises because something was happening before. And that if you want to solve the problem, you won't have to deal with the things that were happening before they became humanitarian crisis or the cause of humanitarian crisis. So in the case of Venezuela, I think it's an exemplar of a little bit the problem that happens in other parts of Latin America, like in Nicaragua or Cuba, where essentially you have governments that take away all the rights of their citizens. And if you disempower your citizens, they cannot plan, they cannot act, they cannot invest, they cannot dream. And that causes the economy to perform very poorly, and for people to realize that their human capital is worth much more somewhere else than there, right? Because they've destroyed the engine that makes the economy go. And Venezuela is in some dark sense poetic because it's on top of the largest oil reserves in the world, and in spite of that, you know, you've seen a collapse of GDP of 75%. That's 3 Great Depressions, and the exit of 8 million people. Now, in the world we live in, democracy is still sort of like an internationally shared value and a source of legitimacy. So you have dictators feel the need that they need to call elections, and so Maduro called elections, but he did not know that there was going to be an organized civil society that uses technology to show the fraud in the election by having, you know, all the tallies of all the booths and so on, and share them with the international community. So right now we have a situation where you have a government that has a deep internal sense of illegitimacy. And in the process of trying to survive, it has destroyed the legitimacy of all the other organizations, the National Assembly, the Supreme Court, the Attorney General, the Army, etc. So right now we're in this situation where the obstacle is the government. The government has become an international criminal organization that's involved in narco trafficking, that's involved in money laundering, that's involved in the finance of terrorism and so on. And it's become an incredible source of problems for the region, right? Because it's not only the migration crisis, which is important, but I mean, all countries in Latin America are struggling with organized crime. These are sophisticated organizations that can corrupt your institutional system, your court system, your police system, and it's something that societies are struggling for a way to find how to cope, and it's not obvious how to do it. So if you ask me about 2025, I think that we are receiving two incoherent messages from the Trump administration. Or I wouldn't say from the Trump administration, say from the US, okay? On the one hand, we hear very forcefully and very clearly people like Marco Rubio or Mike Waltz, defining what the nature of the problem is, the nature of the challenge, that suggests a willingness to be helpful in reestablishing democratic order. On the other hand, you hear other voices. I'm going to mention Bernie Moreno, the new senator from Ohio, saying that we have to deal with the people who were there, more or less normalizing Maduro, dealing with Maduro. The previous administration reduced sanctions on Maduro that allowed them to have more money with which to stay in power. And interestingly enough, that leads to more outmigration. Because on the one hand, it discourages people from thinking that there will be a solution to the crisis so that they must leave. But to the extent that it relaxes some liquidity constraints, it gives people the money with which to leave. So there is a discussion in the US that if you tighten sanctions, it would be bad for people and consequently migration will increase. We've just finished a study showing that the correlation goes the other way. That it is the hope for change that keeps people at home.
Comfort, if I can pivot back to you. And of course, in the Venezuelan context, you do have a regime that is trying to find leverage in its ties to China and Russia as well. Comfort, you talked about this kind of era, great power competition that's overshadowing a lot of our focus. Given that we've seen in Davos so many people, the Ukraine House, others, shaping their messaging for a Trumpist world, your nation first. I've spoken to a bunch of different ministers and heads of state who said, yeah, we're in a my country first world. What does that do to the work of an institution like Crisis Group? What does that do for the ability of the international system to, when it's already in such rough shape, to reckon with all these crises and humanitarian disasters that we're talking about?
Yeah, good question. I mean, we've always dealt with the world as it is.
Sure.
I mean, there's an ideal state that you want to get to. So in an ideal state, you would want that there would be an affinity between Xi Jinping and Trump that may help lower the temperature. And the fact that he hasn't put out that 60% tariff yet may be indicative of that. You would want a situation where maybe in 6 months you see a freezing of the lines in Ukraine, give a pause to end the suffering, and then you start dealing with the more difficult questions around sort of demilitarization and the fate of Ukraine. And then you also deal with Sino-Russia relationships as well. So you want a situation where you do lower the temperature as well. In an ideal world, also, you'd want a situation where the dysfunctionality of the Security Council doesn't infect some important files, so the Security Council can do the work that it's mandated to do, rather than a situation that we have today where the Security Council has effectively marginalized itself and its ability to shape facts on the ground in a number of conflicts. Sudan, for example, is a good one. You mentioned Haiti. We will get that peacekeeping force, the rehatting of the Kenyan police force into an international peacekeeping operation. Is that possible? In an ideal world, you'll see a situation where there could be a more tougher response to what is happening in the Great Lakes, where that we will be able to get back to Yemeni talks and the talks that was going on between Saudi Arabia and Yemen before the 7th of October. That's an ideal world, lots of things. What I will say at the same time is that, you know, you can't divorce you can't divorce ourselves from what you called as my nation first. You can't divorce ourselves from national interest. These are facts of global politics as well. But I do think there is a serious question mark about the crisis of the crisis management system itself. That it's very hard now to see who the key mediators are that have the influence and leverage to change the dynamics in a country like Sudan. I mean, we have to say that it's an indictment of the Biden administration that as it was walking out of government, out of a sense of frustration, and realizing that it no longer has any diplomatic leverage, does what I think is the easy task of sanctioning actors that a year or two ago we recognize as committing the most heinous crimes. And it is an admission. At the same time, I qualify what I say because from a Sudanese perspective, you have to answer the accountability and justice question. So you have to deal with the fact that you are dealing with bad actors. And I sympathize with Sudanese that if we could find a way in which to neutralize these forces, the Sudanese Armed Forces, for example, and the Rapid Support Force, that would be an ideal state. But we're not in a perfect world, and I suspect we need to craft an ugly deal, and an ugly deal that deals with the fact of these two actors as well. And that will be the same in any of the processes that we have to deal with. I think we are in a crisis of peacemaking. I mean, where was the last comprehensive peace deal, peace settlement that we saw? I mean, we have to go back to Colombia, for example, of 2016. We have to go back to Bolsonaro, for example, of the Philippines. What we're seeing right now is a victor's peace, a heavily militarized response to dealing with a lot of crisis as well. How do you begin to find a scenario where we can deal with the litany of issues that you've pointed out? And what you said about Venezuela, I'm afraid that in fact you just pointed us to the reality that will unfold in Venezuela because of the oil dimension, but also because we need to find a way in which we marry the reality of a government that is in power despite the election results, and then how you deal with the burden on the ground. So it's a difficult weaving together. It's going to be a very difficult balancing act, but we've got to find a way in which to get the system to work effectively to respond to all the issues that you've raised, Carol. I don't want people also to leave with a degree of pessimism, because at the end of the day, there are bits of the system that are working. UNICEF is a good example. WFP is a good example. The key is making sure that they are given the space in which to be the first respondents while we work out the more harder political question about how we get a political agreement to stick and that is implemented. And that, I think, is the conundrum for Gaza, for example, today. Yeah.
And this idea of a crisis in peacemaking is such an important one, especially when you think about the fact that for the efforts that have existed on the world stage, no one has been able to exert enough leverage on a faction that is, frankly, probably not as powerful as it seems to be in the junta in Myanmar or in these two warring parties in Sudan. The fact that the international system is not able to create the leverage needed to get them to stop.
Yeah. I mean, look, you mentioned Myanmar. It's the other conflict, and I think a lot of it hinges on China. I mean, So you mentioned 2025. The key development that will happen this year in Myanmar is in elections. I mean, is this the right moment to have an elections? I think it's important to acknowledge that that elections themselves can be conflict-inducing. They can create more havoc, create more mess. They don't necessarily result in a legitimate outcome, but they can also be conflict-reducing. We have an entrenched government today in Myanmar, but you also have a strong resistance group that is also pushing against the junta. Can China use its own leverage also to alter the dynamics on the ground? And I think there is a big question mark, and the region itself is having to deal with a number of refugees on its border, and a number of non-state groups also who are creating governance structures that they need to engage also in Myanmar.
And we'll need, frankly, another whole session on that. Kathy, to put you a bit on the spot, Comfort was talking about the dysfunctions of the Security Council, the way it's marginalizing itself. Obviously, we have a Trump administration that approaches the UN with a bit of a wrinkled nose and wants to cut aid, is suspicious of multilateral institutions. You're talking about a humanitarian system that's failing already, funding shortfalls. Where do you go from here?
It's a good question. Look, I think that the way I see this is the humanitarian world comes in because there are political failures, right? We're the Band-Aids. We're trying to put things back together. We're trying to help people who are at the mercy of powers that they have no control over. And as I said at the outset, we are strained, and we are straining under the number and the complexity and the scale of these problems. And I think, UNICEF, we do development and humanitarian. So in that sense, we're an unusual agency. And so we're always trying to build the seeds of development in what we do. And hopefully over time, that can lead to peace if people have more prosperity, if they're educated. But that's a long-term solution. In the short term, we do need leadership somewhere to stop some of these crises and to step in and say, we can't have a world like this. We can't have a world where children are starving to death and where millions and millions of children are not being educated and millions of children are suffering all sorts of terrible fates. And I think, again, in a way, the humanitarian piece is a success story, sort of, in that we do know what to do and we are able to help people, and we provide, this is not just UNICEF, it's the other UN agencies, WFP is fantastic, and also an NGO ecosystem that is just terrific and does amazing work. We save millions and millions of lives, but we're not the answer. The answer is to stop the conflict in the first place. We have no power to do that. And so we are at the mercy of this really dysfunctional political system is the way I would see it. And I think until somebody can come out and, whether it's the Security Council, I think it's really, the Security Council is made up of member states. It's the countries. It's not some, abstraction. It is the countries who have to come together and decide that they're going to put their own interests aside, hopefully, and try to look out what's best for their countries and their regions and the world at large.
We're almost out of time, but Ricardo, I'd like to turn to you with a somewhat specific question. If the Trump administration enacts what Trump says he wants to, which is this program of mass deportations on the border, if he effectively scraps how the U.S. processes asylum and handles migration, what does that mean for the region? What does that mean? Does it represent any kind of particular rupture or hinge moment in the region?
I think that what reality will impose is the fact that the reason why there was a surge in migration to the U.S. is because it was a super tight labor market in the U.S. And the labor market remains quite tight in the U.S., and action on the migration front will worsen the situation in the labor market, will force the Fed to not lower interest rates, maybe even raise interest rates, because it will tend to accelerate inflationary pressures. So we will see how this works out through the process. But let me say, in the context of Venezuela, solving the repercussions of the Venezuelan crisis by attacking the refugees in the US, it's sort of like blaming the victim for the problem, when the US does have the capacity to act on the problem. And in some sense, what we're witnessing is a crisis in the collective defense of democracy. Now, collective defense of democracy might be too big of a term for the world, but it is the law of Latin America, of the Americas. There's a democratic charter that the countries of the Americas have signed that defends the collective defense of democracy, because civil society can sometimes not protect themselves from dictators. And we must say that there are maybe 14 countries in the region that strongly abide by the principles of the collective defense of democracy, but that important countries, particularly Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia, have essentially reneged on their commitments for the collective defense of democracy. And there's nothing as jarring as the difference between the position of a left-wing government like Chile and the position of these other three left-wing governments, where Chile has just announced that they have evidence that a Venezuelan refugee that happened to be a lieutenant in the army that was murdered in Chile was murdered on the orders of our current Minister of the Interior, who paid this cartel called Tren de Aragua, TDA, they call them in the US, which is an organized criminal organization that killed this person on behalf of the Venezuelan government. And in that context, we see that the mechanisms of collective defense of democracy that are on the books are not being blocked, I would say, blocked by Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia. There's a responsibility not only in the US government, there's a responsibility in Latin America, and it shows that alignments, because people define themselves as left-wing, seem to be more important than the alignments in between people that define themselves as Democrats or dictatorship. And I think that's a message to Latin America.
Well, thank you. And unfortunately, we're out of time. This conversation could be double its length, and hopefully will in the coming days and coming years at Davos as well. But thank you all, and thank you to my panel.
Thank you.